The Syntergic Theory by Jacobo Grinberg Zilberbaum, 1991. Introduction. I have dedicated 15 years to the creation and development of a novel body of thought which I have called the Syntergic Theory. In this book, I present the conceptual basis of this model of reality. Over the years, I have published a series of books and research articles that have originally attempted to share the evolution of my thinking, but I have never presented the Syntergic Theory as a finished and complete product. This book aims to satisfy this desire and purpose of synthesizing, in a single text, a whole theory that by force has to continue to be perfected, but that already appears to be solid and well-founded. The origin of the Syntergic Theory was the question as to how the transformation of cerebral activity into sensible experience takes place. The appearance of a percept qualitatively different from neuronal activity and distinct from spatial energy fields. Light, as such, is found neither in electromagnetic fields in space nor in brain activity, intrigued and amazed me at such a deep level of my being, that I decided to devote myself entirely to explore the possibility of explaining this appearance using any useful tool, from pure neurophysiological research to shamanic and mystical studies. In fact, during these 15 years, the search for an answer to the question about the creation of experience and perception has forced me to review, live, and explore areas of human knowledge that are apparently dissimilar and even contradictory to each other, but that in the light of the question I asked myself have seemed to me complementary and mutually enriching. In this way, studies and conceptions of contemporary quantum mechanics, psychophysiological approaches, elements of Jewish and Christian mysticism, developments of Buddhism and Hindu yoga, and the experiences of Mexican shamans have contributed the pieces of a vital and fascinating game of beads that, as in the masterful novel by Hermann Hesse, has constituted a playful delight that I now intend to share with readers interested in understanding the roots of the creation of any and all possible realities for the human mind. With this work, I intend to share with readers interested in understanding the roots of the creation of any and all possible realities for the human mind. Chapter 1. The Structure of the Space. To the common sense and the bare perception of conceptualizations, space appears as empty and lacking a fundamental structure. This lack, however, is only apparent, since it depends on the brain's inability to decode an energetic organization that surpasses neuronal complexity. This incapacity also manifests itself in the conceptual field when a poorly developed mind is presented with some abstract idea that surpasses it, or when the experience of the other does not have an experiential reference in oneself. Something similar happens in relation to the structure of space, which is presented as invisible and even non-existent for perception. However, the fact that from a tiny portion of space it is possible to decode a visual image with a very high informational content indicates that there is a structure of space capable of including that information. In fact, the human capacity of spatial decoding suggests and indicates that the informational content of the whole universe is represented and concentrated in each of the points of space. For example, we can perceive a starry sky of billions of kilometers of extension, seeing it through a small hole made in a sheet of paper. What we perceive is the information contained in the space of the hole. The same conclusion is reached from the use of optical amplifying instruments. For example, the information from a powerful telescope focused on a distant galaxy is transformed through the visual system of an astronomer into an image with a great amount of details about the stars. What the telescope does is to amplify the information that interacts with its mirror in the observatory space, so that information about distant objects is found in every zone of that space. From the same point, an infinite number of objects can be focused, so that point contains the information about those objects. From these observations, it can be deduced that each point of space contains the total information of the rest of the points, and that there must exist a structure capable of containing such information. Quantum mechanics has baptized this structure with the term lattice. The lattice or latticework must have a colossal capacity of informational inclusion to allow it to contain all the information of the universe in each of its points. The Guarani Indians have wanted to express the same idea using a textile writing. They weave their ideas by expressing them through embroidered fabrics. The fabric that represents the space is made by making the threads of the rest of the fabric to touch each stitch of the fabric. The maximum amount of information that a structure is capable of containing depends mainly on its vibrational capacity. For example, the higher the frequency at which an energetic field can vibrate, the more information it can carry and contain. From this point of view, the lattice of space must be able to vibrate at infinite frequencies in each of its points. On the other hand, the amount of information that a structure is capable of containing depends on the number of dimensions it includes. A plane, for example, is capable of containing less information than a three-dimensional object. From this point of view, the fundamental structure of space or the lattice of space must be located and include an enormous amount of dimensions. We could deduce, from the above considerations, that the structure of the lattice of space consists of a colossal, multidimensional, vibrational capacity matrix in which the information of its totality converges at each of its points. Another characteristic of the lattice structure, deduced from our perception, is that, by modifying a portion of this structure, this modification affects each and all of its points. For example, we can observe the explosion of a supernova from any area of space using an instrument with sufficient power. In the same way, the flight of an insect can be seen from any point of a place, so that the change exerted on a zone of the lattice must, by force, affect and modify the rest of its portions. From this point of view, the lattice must possess a structure similar to that of a superconductor of total fluidity and capacity of interaction between each and every one of its elements. In addition to the above and also deduced from our perception, the structure of the lattice is non-empty in all its extension and in each of its points. For example, let's move in any direction of the space or place ourselves in any of its locations, and we will never find an area in which the image resulting from the decoding of the lattice disappears. Therefore, the lattice occupies the entire space with no zones of absence of the lattice. From the above, it follows that the structure of the lattice is that of a superconducting matrix of multiple dimensions, without discontinuity zones, with a colossal vibrational capacity and an organization of total convergence at any of its points. Another characteristic of the lattice, also deduced from our perception, is that the information contained in its structure can be decoded as a continuum. When, for example, we move in one direction, when, for example, we move in one direction, the images merge with each other, giving us the sensation of perceptual continuity. Of course, this continuity depends on the characteristics of our brain processing, which acts as a kind of reality glue, but it also reflects a basic informational continuity contained in the fundamental structure of the lattice itself. Another characteristic of the lattice is that it possesses the ability to modify its own structure on different time scales. A neutron is a modification of the basic structure of the lattice, with a greater fixity and permanence than a meson. In the same way, a rock is a distortion of the lattice with a longer duration than the flame of a candle. We will see later that a thought or an emotion also affects the structure of the lattice, and are distortions of the same structure, just like what we call a macroscopic material object or a microscopic elementary particle. The temporal permanence of a distortion of the lattice depends, among other things, on the recurrence of the distortion and on whether its structure coincides with some natural mode of organization of the lattice. An area of the lattice in which there are no distortions must be totally homogeneous and coherent. From the perceptual point of view, this pole of total coherence would appear as invisible and empty of objects. In it, an instrument capable of detecting some gravitational index would show an absence of this force, indicating a lack of curvatures of space. On the other hand, in a zone of the lattice with local distortions, our perception detects the presence of objects, and the gravitational instrument will show the presence of gravitation, indicating the existence of curvatures of space. At this pole of the lattice, the coherence is less than in the lattice in its basic, undistorted state. A perceptual example denoting the differences in coherence of the lattice can be seen in the so-called relative motion effect between objects distant and close to an observer. Objects far away from an observer remain fixed and seem to follow its motion. Observe the moon from a moving car. On the other hand, objects close to the observation point do not remain fixed and change their position relative to the movement of the observer, the road, or the trees near the car. This is explained considering that the information about distant objects is represented in the space with which the observer interacts in a more coherent way than the near ones, so that at each point of interaction, the information of distant objects would seem to be duplicated, and therefore their perception from any point is the same. On the other hand, the informational representation in the interaction zone with the lattice of objects close to the observer is not coherent, and therefore each point contains different informational organization, and therefore the perceptual appearance is of change relative to the movement of the observer. The differences of coherence in the informational organization of the lattice are associated with the levels of convergence of the information of each point. In a hypothetical zone of maximum coherence of the lattice, far from any distortion, each point contains the total information of the universe coherently distributed, because in that zone, the informational convergence is maximum. On the other hand, in the points of the lattice close to distortions of its structure, the angles of convergence of different distortions change, giving rise to a decrease in the similarity of the informational organization of those points, and therefore a lower coherence. In fact, our nervous system detects the changes of coherence of the lattice by manifesting them to our perception as sensations of approaching or moving away with respect to objects and as the perception of speed and acceleration. The zones of the lattice of greater coherence, the syntergic theory calls them zones of high syntergia, while the zones of lower coherence are called zones of low syntergia. The term syntergia is a neologism derived from the words synthesis and energy. The pole of higher syntergy of the lattice has a structure of maximum coherence, information density, convergence, and homogeneity, and neither gravitational changes nor discrete objects can be detected in it. This is because gravitation and matter are associated with distortions of the basic organization, coherence of the lattice. On the other hand, the low syntergy of the lattice, what we perceive as solid matter, has a structure of minimum coherence, low informational density, minimum convergence, and homogeneity, detecting gravitational forces in it. The lattice, in its fundamental state, possesses an amazing potential capacity for modification. Each and every one of the elementary particles and of the fields and forces described by contemporary physics arise from the possible distortions that the lattice is capable of assuming. Thus, an electron, a proton, a neutron, or any other elementary particle comes into existence when the basic structure of the lattice itself undergoes specific modifications. This is why elementary particles and in general all matter possess a dual wave corpuscular nature. A particle is simultaneously an independent object and separate from the rest of the objects, and a modified portion of the same fundamental structure. In Buddhism, this duality is conceptualized under the denomination of sunyata, or emptiness. This concept implies the consideration that no object possesses absolute and independent existence, but is part of a matrix of interrelationships, and therefore feeds on the rest with which it is interconnected and on which its existence depends. The lattice shows the same characteristics. Everything is intertwined within its structure, and every object and matter arises from specific modifications or distortions of it, manifesting an interdependent existence with the rest of the objects. We will see later that neither the individual experience, the body, or the brain escape this condition of void or sunyata. Therefore, the lattice possesses the potential capacity to manifest itself in multiple conditions and infinite forms, being this capacity another of its basic characteristics. The structure capable of the above must consist of some absolutely plastic material, in the sense of its infinite capacity to assume different forms. Now, I mentioned earlier that one of the characteristics of the organization of the lattice structure is its continuity. This continuity, however, exists only partially and within what could be called discrete bands of organization. There are families of lattice distortions and quantum layers of its organization distributed in discrete levels. Physics calls these bands forces, and 4 of them have been described: 1 gravitational force, 2 weak interaction force, 3 strong interaction force, 4 electromagnetic force. Each of these forces or fields are particular families of fundamental lattice distortions. Within each band there is continuity, but from one to the other there is an abrupt step. In this text, and as part of the synturgic theory, I will call these bands, forces, or fields synturgic bands. The consideration of the synturgic bands is essential to understand the existence of the also discrete levels of consciousness, because each level of consciousness is associated with a synturgic band. The ignorance of sunyata has led the Western mind to forget that between reality and its perception, there are varied and complex processes of transformation by the neuronal machinery. In this way, we confuse the product of these transformations with their origin. We consider, for example, that there is a world outside us with objects detached from our processing, when in reality we actively intervene in the creation of perceptual reality, and we are not detached from the objects we perceive, nor from the living beings with which we interact. Reality is one, but as Ken Wilber rightly says, we divide it with boundaries of separation that depend on the level of consciousness in which we function and not on reality itself. Our brain system interacts with a limited portion of the lattice through its receptive organs. This portion of the lattice is transformed into a neuronal language, and after several transformations that will be explained later, a perceptual image is created, which is always a representation and not reality itself. In order to access this reality, we should first place ourselves in unity consciousness, erase all our filters, personal history, and conditioning. As this possibility is rarely actualized, the reality we perceive, we confuse it with reality. In this way, as space, for our limited perception, appears to us as invisible and objects as separate and autonomous, we consider that reality is constituted by objects external to us and with absolute existence, when in truth neither objects are autonomous and independent nor space is non-existent. We could even solidify space or dematerialize objects just as Milarepa, the legendary Tibetan poet, did, or as some of the most powerful Mexican shaman Nawals do. We do not know what is outside ourselves and what stimulates us. We only know the final product of our brain processing, but we confuse it with reality itself. It is enough to remember that in a point of space, the totality of the information of the universe is concentrated, and that we partially decode that information, and from there we construct our perceptions to realize that what we perceive is a limited human creation, and that the qualities that we attribute to reality are the result of a restricted interaction with the lattice of space. For example, light as such does not exist in the lattice, nor does sound. The point of the lattice that we decode does not contain the geometry of the image that results from its cerebral processing as it is presented to our perception. The lattice point that we decode is a colossally complicated set of energetic morphologies concentrated in a structure. There are no colors or shapes, no changes of perspective or external objects. It is the way we decode those morphologies and transform them that results in what we see. Of course, any point of the lattice contains, in an algorithmic way, all the elements that later make an image appear. All the details of any percept, all the geometric shapes, colors, changes of perspective and textures are algorithmically concentrated in each point of the lattice. But in its decoding we add our own brain structure and organization, and from the interaction between it and the lattice features, the qualities, light, sound, texture, etc., that are familiar to us emerge. Each point of the lattice contains in its structure much more information and decoding possibilities than our brain can decode. The decoding capacity will depend on the neuronal functioning, and this functioning, in turn, is determined and determines the level of consciousness in the lattice at which we function. Therefore, it is the level of consciousness of each person that determines the reality we perceive. The way we decode the lattice is not random. We will see later that the very organization of the human brain is a model of the lattice. But this model does not yet become identical to the territory it wants to represent. Only when we become the lattice itself will we be able to perceive reality as it exists and as it is in itself. This possibility is not impossible and is within our reach, but it depends on the achievement of a development towards unity consciousness to actualize it. This chapter, devoted to unraveling the structure of space and lattice, should not leave in the reader's mind the impression that lattice is the ultimate level of reality, or that nothing exists outside of lattice reality. The discussion of the possible existence of something, not restricted to the lattice, I cannot address in this chapter, but I can mention it now and analyze it later. For the time being, I will devote the following chapters to the analysis of the transformations that our brain exerts on the lattice until it leads to our perception and images. I will emphasize the decoding associated with the visual world because of all the perceptual levels. It is the one that most exemplifies our action on the lattice and the transformations it undergoes. Before concluding, I would like to mention that contemporary physics is, like synturgic theory, interested in understanding the basic structure of space. The methodology of physics is, however, different from the one I have used. Physicists use a sophisticated mathematical tool and a series of experiments specific to their discipline to arrive at their conclusions. The same conclusions can be reached by using, as I have done here, an analysis based on the phenomenology of human perception and that of other organisms. The closest physical theory to the lattice conception is the superstring theory. It postulates that beneath the existence of elementary particles is a common reality formed by ultramicroscopic strings, all similar to each other but interacting in different ways, giving rise, depending on the type of interaction involved, to each of the particles and families of elementary particles. The synturgic theory holds that below the reality of the superstrings there is another even less differentiated level, from which the superstrings arise, and this is the lattice with all the characteristics I have described. Finally, these characteristics still form a restricted repertoire that deserves further investigation and analysis. Chapter 2. The neural field and its structure. The current human brain appears in nature after millions of evolutionary attempts to create an organic structure capable of experimenting and decoding as many synturgic bands as possible. The solution devised to achieve this portentous feat involved the invention of a neuronal machinery capable of mimicking the fundamental structure of the lattice. Of course, this work was not done in a few days but required billions of years of experimentation. The brain emerged from the lattice itself, as if the lattice in its sublime and absolute unity had wished to create a model of itself, in which it could reflect itself, and thus resolve its infinite solitude. In the unity there are no companions, since everything is included within the self. If an organic model of the lattice was created, it had to fully satisfy the necessary lattice-like mimicry, that is to say, to possess the same characteristics as its origin, including its capacity to become unique. The Mexican Indians, in their enviable wisdom, intuited the above. Therefore, in the Tzeltal language, the word education is pij wo tes el, whose literal translation is to make another become unique. From a psychophysiological point of view, the creation of the human brain as a model of the lattice proceeded naturally and in stages. First, a biological superconductor had to be invented, capable of transmitting information without losses, and with a formidable capacity to interconnect with and concentrate information from other superconductors. These purposes were fulfilled with the creation of the neuron and its axon. The neuronal body is capable of receiving thousands of contacts through its dendrites, concentrating this afferent information and sending a resulting code through its axon by means of a biological mechanism of superconduction. The axon transmits the code without resistance through saltatory conduction and sodium-potassium pump recharge. This afferent information, in turn, is sent to other neurons who integrate it into a new code that is again transmitted and interconnected. The first brains were constituted by very few neurons, and therefore were very poor in their capacity to mimic the lattice, since throughout evolution, the only constant structure that has remained unchanged is the lattice itself. Its organization acted and continues to act as an extraordinary reference point. For this reason, Tibetan wisdom has devised a meditation technique, the Mahamudra, whose object is the direct perception of the immaculate and self-fulfilling origin of any thought and experience, that is to say, the contact with the basic structure of the lattice. As a result of a colossal repulsive force that the lattice exerts on its distortions, trying to make them return to their origin, and of another force, no less powerful but of opposite sign, which drives the same distortions to join together and increase their complexity, and from the primitive brains, the present human brain arises with its 12 million neurons and with a capacity of internal interconnection whose combinatory possibilities are similar in number to the total of elementary particles of the whole universe. The colossal mystery of the return to the origin is thus solved, not through entropic disintegration, but through the audacity of creating oneself on equal terms with the Creator. In this return, we gain the possibility of consciously experiencing as total and unique individuals, not only those forces manifested in our emotions, in the mysteries of sexuality, and in the agony of pain, but in all the nuances of our sensorium and our mental and spiritual activity. Woe to him who refuses to flow in experience. He betrays in this way all the immense effort deposited in his creation. The human brain has solved the challenge of mimicking the lattice by creating circuits that interconnect all its biological superconductors. These circuits are, moreover, destined to decode the syntergic bands through a procedure that globally could be called neuroalgorithmization. On the other hand, the capacity of qualitative experience has been resolved through a cerebral mechanism of direct interaction with the lattice, which the syntergic theory calls neuronal field. Neuroalgorithmic decoding allows us to think, conceptualize, speak, and philosophize. The neural field grants us the grace to experience. The neuroalgorithmic system is digital. That of the neural field is analogical. I will begin by analyzing the neuroalgorithmic system, describing its operations and results, and then I will talk about the neural field and its structure. Neuroalgorithmic decoding. The human retina is a mechanism of neuroalgorithmic decoding of the lattice, and therefore I will use it as an example. Endowed with more than 300 million receptors that transform the electromagnetic fields of photons into generating electric potentials, constituted by at least 3 layers of interconnecting cells that are as many levels of neuroalgorithmic decoding and 1 million output axons, the retina transforms a portion of the lattice into an electric code in at least 1 million two-dimensional channels, which penetrates to the rest of the visual structures of the brain. Each axon of the optic nerve concentrates in a digital electrical code the information coming from hundreds of retinal receptors. These converge the information originating in the lattice to a layer of bipolar cells, which in turn converges to a third layer of ganglion cells. Each ganglion cell receives information from several bipolar cells, which in turn incorporate information from dozens of receptors. The output of the ganglion cells, the axons of the optic nerve, concentrate in a unified code, the information that originally activated in a dispersed form a set of receptors. Any code that concentrates information concentrates it in an algorithm, because an algorithm is a formula or code that concentrates information coming from different sources. The retinal mechanism of algorithmization creates in the axons of the optic nerve a neuroalgorithm that through 1 million channels concentrates the information coming from more than 300 million receptors. This code is discrete because it is made up of electrical pulses of milliseconds in duration, forming complex temporal patterns. Thus, 1 million digital patterns contain the neuroalgorithmization of the information contained in a tiny portion of the lattice. Neuroalgorithmization by convergence causes a neuronal population to concentrate information from a vast cellular territory in the same way that a point in the lattice concentrates information from the rest of the lattice. Neuroalgorithmic information coming from the retina must be decoded in order to result in a visual image. This task is performed by a thalamic nucleus and then by the cerebral cortex. In the latter, neuroalgorithmization processes by convergence mixed with divergent processing continue. Neuroalgorithmic codes are able to concentrate in a restricted neuronal population the information of billions of neurons, and thus mimic the informational convergence of the lattice. Neuroalgorithmic codes of the visual system interact with codes of the auditory system and other systems. These interconnections activate in the polysensory association cortexes, second and third order neuroalgorithms, concentrating even more information. A neurosynergic continuum of the brain, similar to the synergic continuum of the lattice, can be abstracted, in which the lower neurosynergy pole is located near the surface of the receptors, and the high neurosynergy pole is located in the polysensory structures of high neuroalgorithmic level. As in lattice, the low brain neurosynergy pole is less coherent and of minimal convergence compared to the high brain neurosynergy pole. In the high neurosynergy pole, abstract thinking, conceptualization, and language occur, while the low neurosynergy pole is associated with much more concrete processes. As in the lattice, the high neurosynergy pole contains greater informational density, vibrates at higher frequency, is more coherent and more convergent than its lower neurosynergic counterpart. Likewise, the higher neurosynergy pole contains a greater number of dimensions than the lower neurosynergy pole due to the polysensory character of the former and the unisensory character of the latter. A high neurosynergic neuroalgorithm incorporates a longer processing time so that the functions associated with its activation imply an expansion in the duration of the present. This expansion means that in the high neurosynergic neuroalgorithmic code, events belonging to different temporal orders are included and concentrated. The complexity of a function is directly related to its neurosynergic level. Therefore, conceptual and high abstraction processes are associated with a high neurosynergic functioning, since they imply a high informational density and a powerful neuroalgorithmization. The similarity between the structure of the lattice and the organization of the brain is remarkable and can be verified for each of the conditions that I analyzed in Chapter I, namely 1 in the lattice. An informational convergence is observed at each of its points. In the brain, the convergence starts from the receptor structures and becomes noticeable in the polysensory portions of high neuroalgorithmic capacity. In them, a high inclusion code algorithmically concentrates information coming from the rest of the system. 2. The modification of any portion of the lattice affects and is represented in each and every one of its points. In the brain, Schwartz and Ramos performed an experiment in cats, demonstrating that single-cell response patterns in neurons recorded in different portions of the brain were correlated with learning. This experiment indicates that the modification of information is represented in all units of the brain. E. Roy John's experiments also support this conclusion. Thus, as in the lattice, in the brain the modification of one of its portions affects all the others. 3. The relationship between informational coherence and the phenomenon of relative motion in the lattice is also observed in the brain. The latter is related to the processes of neuroalgorithmization in the different levels of convergence of the brain. For example, if we modify the information of the retinal receptors, this alteration will cause a greater variation in the neuroalgorithmic codes of the bipolar cells than in the ganglion cells. In turn, the neuroalgorithmic codes of high inclusion power in polysensory structures will undergo minimal changes compared to those of ganglion cells. In fact, the conceptualization and abstraction processes linked to the responses of polysensory analysis structures maintain a constancy despite changes in informational input. This has been demonstrated experimentally by Grinberg, Zilberbaum, and E. R. John. It could be postulated that the most powerful levels of neuroalgorithmization in the brain are associated with ego functions of high constancy, being similar to that of the homogeneous and highly coherent informational representation of objects far removed from an observer. 4. There is neural activity in a living brain at all times, even during deep sleep or in the silence of meditative states. Therefore, there are no discontinuities of emptiness or absence of activity in the brain, in the same way that in the lattice there are no empty zones of information. 5. The lattice shows a colossal plasticity in the sense that from its basic structure distortions are activated in infinite number. The brain shows a similar capacity of modification and plasticity. It is enough to remember the amount of detail in dream images or the creative possibility in art. When, for example, someone is asked to recreate an image of a past event from a verbal command, one can assume the occurrence of several chained processes to give rise to it. Firstly, the transduction of sound into neural codes. Secondly, the neuroalgorithmization of these codes. Thirdly, the activation of some polysensory structure. And finally, the synthesis of some high-power polysensory neuroalgorithm and the activation of a visual image associated with the divergent decoding of this neuroalgorithm. The fact that the brain is capable of internal representations in practically infinite number resembles the also infinite capacity of the lattice. 6. I had mentioned that for the lattice, there are distortions with a variable temporal duration from practically instantaneous ones, as would be the case of some elementary particles with an infinitesimal half-life to a proton or a neutron with an immense lifetime. In the brain, there are also mnemic patterns of short life. Remember here the iconic memory. Of medium life, the short-term memory, and of an enormous duration, the long-term memories. As in the lattice, The temporal duration of the brain is associated with the recurrence of its patterns and with the naturalness of the patterns and their meaning. 7. There are different levels of brain coherence in the same way that they exist in the lattice. Coherence in the brain is a measure of the similarity of the patterns of its activity in the different zones of its structure. The greater this similarity, the greater the brain coherence. A measure of the unified functioning of the brain is interhemispheric coherence. In laboratory studies, we have found that as interhemispheric coherence increases, the sensation of internal unification increases, and states of internal silence are activated. The states of high interhemispheric coherence are conditions of high neurosynergic, and would seem to correspond with the levels of organization of superior syntergia of the lattice, in which there are no distortions of the lattice. There is absence of objects and gravitational forces. That is to say, there is also silence. 8. Another similarity between the lattice and the brain is the absence of isomorphisms. In the brain, the output of the optic nerve, activated by the retinal stimulation, is a digitized code of 1,000,000 channels that has no resemblance neither with the image resulting from its decoding, nor with the energetic organization of the lattice that stimulated it. In the same way, in the lattice, the information that converges in each of its points has no direct resemblance with the distortions it represents. 9. Finally, just like the organization of syntergic bands of the lattice, which are internally continuous but discrete from band to band, in the brain there are sensory bands and bands of consciousness which are internally continuous but discrete from band to band. Each of the sensory modalities, touch, hearing, sight, etc., correspond to these sensory bands, and each state of consciousness, wakefulness, sleep, paradoxical sleep, etc., belongs to a band of consciousness. The sensory bands and the consciousness bands correspond to different levels of neuroalgorithmization, i.e. to different neurosynergic degrees. For example, the auditory band is activated after 30 milliseconds of brain processing, while the visual band requires 50 milliseconds of processing. The conceptual band needs more than 150 milliseconds of processing. The longer the processing duration, the higher the informational density, and therefore the higher the neurosynergic. The neuronal field and its structure. The structure of the brain as a whole is a complex macrodistortion of the lattice, and its activity distorts the same lattice that gives rise to it. Each dendritic micropotential and each action potential are and activate microdistortions of the lattice. The interaction between all these microdistortions creates a hypercomplex macrodistortion of the same lattice. This hypercomplex macrodistortion is called neuronal field by the syntergic theory. The neuronal field is a mechanism of unification of brain activity, but of analogical type and not digital, as is the neuroalgorithmic processing. The latter is also a unification mechanism, but internal and belonging to the same dimension as the discrete activity of all the cellular components of the living brain. The unification of the neuronal field, on the other hand, occurs in the energetic dimension of the lattice as field. To visualize the complexity of the neuronal field, it is sufficient to consider that each neuron is a three-dimensional structure capable of receiving hundreds of connections. The membrane potential of each neuron oscillates and changes its morphology each time one of its dendrites is activated. These three-dimensional oscillations of the electrical activity of the neuronal somo are as many microdistortions of the lattice. Now let's multiply that image 12 billion times and add all the ionic transports through the axons, together with the extracellular fields. Each microdistortion of that neuronal cosmos interacts with its neighbors, and these in turn with others. Along with all the above, the populations of neurons of high neuroalgorithmic power must incorporate their codes of high informational density to the rest of the microdistortions, etc., etc., etc. The resulting picture is of such complexity that it is almost impossible to visualize. However, several global characteristics of the neuronal field can be clarified from our knowledge of the brain. First, the neural field as a whole can vary its levels of coherence by modifying the greater or lesser morphological similarity between all its portions. Secondly, there must be a continuum of possible frequencies within which the neural field must fluctuate. The greater the informational density handled by a living brain, the higher the frequency of its neural field as a whole must be. A neural field of high coherence and high frequency has greater syntagee than a neural field of low coherence and lower frequency. The lattice interacting with a neural field of higher syntagee must increase its own and decrease it when interacting with a neural field of low syntagee. In turn, a neural field interacting with a lattice of high syntagee must increase its own. On the other hand, a neural field must decrease its syntagee when interacting with a lattice of low syntagee. On the other hand, the three-dimensional geometry of brain circuits varies from structure to structure and from nucleus to nucleus of the brain. Therefore, the energetic morphology of the neural field must reflect that geometry in the lattice by mimicking it. Already in the lattice dimension, the neuronal field is incorporated into the lattice and submits to the structural laws of the lattice. Thus, a variation of a neural field must affect the whole lattice by manifesting itself in each of the points of its structure. In the same way, the sustained recurrence of a certain morphological pattern of the neural field must provoke more or less permanent alterations in the lattice structure, depending on how congruent such morphology is with some natural aspect of the lattice. Since the lattice varies its syntergic organization in internally continuous but globally discrete bands, and the neural field as well, there must be zones or bands of interaction between the neural field and the lattice that are more congruent than others. In these zones, the interaction between both the neural field and the lattice should cause the appearance of an interference pattern clean of noise. In contrast, outside these bands of congruent interaction, the interference patterns should contain noisy and, in the most disparate cases, self-annulling morphologies. The zones of congruent interaction between the neural field and the lattice are called permitted orbitals of consciousness by the syntergic theory. On the other hand, the bands of non-congruent interaction are called non-permitted orbitals of consciousness. A neural field of maximum syntagee, that is, of absolute coherence and high informational density, frequency, is more similar to the basic or fundamental structure of the lattice, that is, to the lattice at its pole of highest syntagee. On the other hand, a neural field of low syntagee is more similar to the lattice at its low syntagee pole. The lattice in high syntagee is free of distortions, curvatures, and gravitational fields. The lattice in low syntagee is closer to matter as we perceive it. The higher the syntagee of a neural field, the more it will be able to interact congruently with the lattice in its fundamental and pure state. On the other hand, a neural field of low syntagee will only be able to interact congruently with the corresponding structural level of the lattice. Being the neural field similar in nature to the lattice, regardless of its level of syntagee, different neural fields must interact with each other, creating intercerebral interference patterns. The structure of the lattice that incorporates these patterns is called the hyperfield by syntergic theory. The hyperfield is the lattice that includes within it all the neural fields, together with their interference patterns. As in the interior of a brain within which all the neuronal microdistortions interact with each other, so it must happen within the lattice for the interactions between all the neuronal fields. In this way, the hyperfield would be equivalent to a planetary neural field whose global structure depends on the matrix of intercerebral interactions. It could be conjectured that the planetary division into countries, cities, towns, villages, etc., determines a particular hyperfield organization, which is represented throughout the length and breadth of the lattice and in each of its points. The hyperfield also incorporates within its structure the neural fields coming from non-human brains. This hyperfield is called expanded hyperfield by the syntergic theory. The brain mechanisms of lattice decoding are also sensitive to the human hyperfield and the expanded hyperfield. The possibility of decoding the lattice and both hyperfields depends on the neuroalgorithmic capacity of a brain. If an organization exceeds in its syntagee the neuroalgorithmic capacity of a brain and the syntagee at which its neural field is able to function, that organization will not be perceived. Only that which does not exceed the cerebral capacity of neuroalgorithmization and the syntagee of a neural field is perceived. The capacity of neuroalgorithmization depends on the existence or not of coding errors. If they exist, this capacity will be limited by them. A brain free of coding errors will be able to decode syntergic bands that another brain with coding errors will not be able to decode. All consciousness development techniques, such as meditation and psychotherapeutic practices, aim at increasing the neuroalgorithmization capacity of the brain, thereby raising the syntagee of the neural field. An elevation of the syntergia of the neural field implies an expansion of the consciousness and an incorporation into the human consciousness of a greater number of syntergic bands. This incorporation is an approach of the individual consciousness to the consciousness of unity. Chapter 3. The experience as a result of the interaction between the neural field and the lattice of space. Paradoxically, since man has assigned to matter the role that corresponds to consciousness as the origin of all things, he has lost the possibility of explaining his own experience when his motivation was precisely to understand it. It is not possible to understand sensible experience by attributing its emergence to an energetic field or to the interaction of several inanimate fields unless the matter-consciousness dichotomy is unified, and consciousness and not matter is postulated as the first datum and starting point. From this point of view, consciousness is a proper attribute of the lattice, and therefore of all its distortions including the neural field and both hyperfields. Also from here, it can be postulated that the syntergic bands are true orbitals of consciousness. The consciousness exists along all the syntergic levels that the lattice is able to assume, but its quality depends on the complexity, coherence, informational density of each one. Thus, the lattice in its basic, undistorted state is pure consciousness, while the hyperfield and all its bands are human consciousness and all its attributes. For example, human auditory consciousness arises when the lattice is distorted by a neural field that emerged from a 12 billion element brain with a density of interactions that requires 20 to 30 milliseconds of processing. In contrast, the human visual consciousness appears when the brain manages to activate a neural field of an informational density and a syntagee that need a minimum of 50 milliseconds of neuronal interactions. Not only the informational density and the processing time make one sensory quality different from another, but also the three-dimensional geometry of the activated brain structure. Thus, the visual neural field contains the three-dimensional morphology derived from the activation of the occipital cortex, while the auditory incorporates in its energetic structure the geometry derived from the neural circuits of the temporal cortex. Due to its morphology, informational density, coherence, and its syntergia, the visual neural field is able to establish a congruent interaction with a similar, syntergic organization of the lattice, contained in one of its bands. We experience the resulting lattice interference pattern as the visual world qualitatively different from the sound reality, which results from the congruent activation of an interference pattern in another, syntergic band. The different qualities of consciousness are known only by direct experience, but the realization of their existence depends on their adequate neuroalgorithmization. Neither consciousness itself can be defined, nor its qualities can be recognized through a theoretical explanation of its energetic components. Such an attempt is, in advance, destined to the same failure and frustration as that which results from the attempt to explain to a blind man what light or sound is to a man born deaf. The qualities of consciousness can only be known through their direct experience, not only for obvious reasons, but also because they belong to and are situated on an axis of evolutionary development to which one must belong, and on which one must be situated in order to have access to the experience of the corresponding quality of consciousness. This evolutionary axis has a direction which was masterfully explained by Teilhard de Chardin with the concepts of complexification and centrality. According to this thinker, evolution has an ascending sense and is directed towards a hypothetical omega point, which acts as a strange attractor of the ideal future of the hyperfield. This same axis of complexification and unification is the one that has determined the union of several elementary particles giving rise to an atom, of several atoms giving rise to a molecule, of several molecules giving rise to a protein, of several proteins giving rise to an elementary cell, of several cells resulting in a tissue, an organ, and an organism. The human brain would seem to be the most recent achievement of this process. In it, the procedures of complexification and unification are accelerated vertiginously by its capacity of neuroalgorithmization and creation of neural fields of high syntagee. From the brain, nature has an instrument of increase of complexity and centrality given by an internal mechanism, thus saving the colossal work and the time required to create new species. The omega point is located in the lattice itself, and when a brain manages to mimic it, it will obtain the colossal gain of the consciousness of the pure consciousness. It seems to think that man voluntarily decided to lose the paradise of the unconscious unity with the lattice in order to gain the paradise of the conscious unity with the same lattice. In this loss and gain, God acted as an accomplice because of his desire to be accompanied by someone of the same boldness and height. The success in this masterly adventure is yet to be seen. The qualities and levels of consciousness are situated on this same evolutionary axis in which the tactile quality appeared before the auditory and the auditory before the visual. A poorly evolved organism with a primitive brain is incapable of creating a neural field with sufficient syntergia to achieve a congruent interaction with the auditory or visual band. Nature had to create brains and organisms with a greater number of elements to achieve neural fields of sufficient syntergia to interact congruently with more complex orbitals of consciousness and thus activate the corresponding sensory qualities. The fact that each quality of consciousness requires more processing time resulted in the increase in the duration of the present for each quality. A visual image with a processing time of 50 milliseconds has a longer present duration than a sound activated after 20 or 30 milliseconds of neural interactions. The expansion in the duration of the present correlated with the syntergic increase results in the capacity to unify in a timeless present what, for a less syntergic quality of consciousness, is located in the future. Total unification would imply the capacity to perceive in a timeless present the past, present, and future of a non-unified consciousness. Each quality of consciousness conquered by an individual from a novel, syntergic mode of functioning is an addition to and not an exclusion of previously gained qualities. Thus, as one progresses, new syntergic bands are incorporated into an ever-expanding consciousness, thus fulfilling the dictum and primary divine purpose of what could be the first commandment of the new age, viz., "Thou shalt experience and decode as many syntergic bands as possible." In Mexican shamanism and in the technique of self-elusive meditation, this first commandment is actualized through the simultaneous observation of an increasing number of experiences in the different areas corresponding to the various qualities of consciousness. The achievement of unity occurs when the observer incorporates in a simultaneous act of observation all the contents of the experience. In this feat, the observer becomes confused with its contents, and the division between the two disappears, thus achieving access to the reality of the pure self. This is the logic on which the self-elusive meditation technique is based. Karl Pribram once said that since there is no isomorphism between a visual image and the brain processing, one should look for some level in this processing that is at least capable of containing the same details of the resulting image. He considered that the level of dendritic micropotentials fulfilled this requirement. The syntergic theory holds that the neural field is the immediate antecedent of the image, not only because it is capable of containing in its structure all the details of the percept, but also because it unifies them. And one of the qualities of visual perception is unification. A visual image is a finished and unified product, and although it is true that neither the coding of the optic nerve is isomorphic with the image, nor the cortical activation is, there must be an immediate antecedent of any image, if not isomorphic with it, at least with the capacity to be so at some level. Otherwise, it would be impossible to explain the relationship between brain activity and experience. The neural field becomes isomorphic with the visual image when its structure interacts with the visual syntergic band. Neither the syntergic band nor the neural field are identical in form, isomorphic with the percept, but the interference pattern resulting from their interaction must be. When two energetic fields interact, they create an emergent structure different from that possessed by each one separately. A simple image that helps to understand this is that of two concentric waves produced on the surface of a pond. When these circular waves interact, a complex geometry is created that ceases to be circular and becomes something else. Something similar but of an infinitely higher order of complexity must happen in the interaction between the neural field and the lattice. The resulting interference pattern, besides being three-dimensional, has syntergic characteristics that are found neither in the isolated neural field nor in the lattice by itself. If an image results from this pattern, there must be a moment immediately prior to the emergence of the image in which the energetic dimension of the lattice assumes the same form as the image. This isomorphism indicates that what we see is actually the interference pattern activated by our neural field in interaction with the lattice. So it is not metaphorical to state that we live inside a kind of bubble of perception, recalling here Carlos Castaneda, and that we are immersed inside our own brain, observing the inner wall of its expansive movement. One wonders if a perception from outside this wall is possible, and what could be the resulting image, and the answer lies in the very existence of the observer. Neither the lattice, nor the neural field, nor their interaction form the ultimate level of reality, or represent an inescapable and all-encompassing prison. There is something outside the existence of the lattice, and even of the two hyperfields, and this something is the observer. Chapter 4. The Orbitals of Consciousness. The term orbitals of consciousness refers to the existence of different levels of consciousness. In reality, the consciousness is one and permeates all manifestation, from the lattice in its basic or fundamental state to any of its distortions including the neural field and both hyperfields. However, the human being delimits the one consciousness and focuses it, resulting in its division into levels. It will depend on the individual functioning, the access to the different levels of the consciousness. This access is in reality a dimensional perceptual transformation, so that the levels of consciousness depend on the perception of the observer and his or her identification. Thus, for example, An observer capable of identifying his individual consciousness with the basic structure of the lattice will reach unity consciousness. On the other hand, an identification of the observer with the organic body will activate a level of bodily consciousness. The observer's dimensional access and control will result in his functioning within a matrix of relationships, and it will constitute his perceptual territory. It would seem that the observer is able to perceive and identify with any and all dimensional layers of the lattice organization, meaning by this that it is itself in a dimension that includes the lattice itself. In other words, the capacity of the observer to perceive all the levels of the lattice, including the lattice in its basic state, implies that the observer does not belong to the universe of the lattice, but to another one independent of it. There are different models that are as many approaches to the analysis and description of the different orbitals of the consciousness. All of them have in common the consideration that the levels of the consciousness depend on the perception of the observer, and this one on the territory with which it identifies itself. I will first present the model proposed by Jewish mysticism, Kabbalah, then the theosophical model, then the shamanic model, then the Buddhist model, the transpersonal psychology model, and finally, the syntergic model, the Kabbalistic model. According to Gershom G. Scholem, in none of their systems did the Kabbalists fail to affirm the existence of interrelationships between all worlds and levels of being. Everything, according to them, is connected with everything else. From any point, infinite depths can be contemplated. According to the system of Moses Cordovero, the ascent of man to higher worlds and to the border of the void does not involve movement on his part, since where you are, there are all the worlds. According to Kabbalah, what is located below is located above, and what is located within is located without. Kabbalah states that not only is the whole contained in each part, but also acts upon all the rest. Although I will analyze the syntergic model later, I cannot resist the temptation here to recall the similarity between these ideas and the organization of the lattice as described in the first chapter of this book. In the same way, the Kabbalistic consideration that any act or thought has an effect on the totality has its experimental demonstration in the effects that the neural field produces on the lattice, other neural fields, and both hyperfields. The model postulated by Kabbalah is simultaneously longitudinal and concentric. The longitudinal approach attempts to solve the mystery of creation from a transcendent and invisible principle to its manifestation in action. This model has at least 6 levels which are as many worlds or universes. Each universe belongs to a different dimension. At the same time, each universe is associated with a level of the soul and with a Hebrew letter. The universe of the Adam Kadmon is that of the primordial or archetypal man. The Adam Kadmon represents the human in its origin or stratum of highest abstraction. It is not, in reality, the first transcendent level, but an extraordinarily elevated manifestation of it. Above Adam Kadmon, the Kabbalah places the Ein Sof, whose translation would be the endless one intimately linked with God. The level of the soul associated with Adam Kadmon is Yichida, whose literal translation is singularity, and which constitutes the one essence, and that which cannot be divided and is one. Just as from the Ein Sof comes the Adam Kadmon, from the Adam Kadmon comes Atzilut, which is the closest to the archetypal man and is associated with the level of the soul Chai, the living essence or the living. In Judaism, the name of God Yehovah is written with 4 letters, the first of which, Yud, corresponds to the Latin I and belongs to the universe of Atzilut or emanation and to the level of the soul Chai or the living. From Atzilut arises the creation or the universe of Bariah, associated with the level of Neshama or Pneuma and with the next letter of God's name, He, which corresponds to the Latin letter H or J. In this way, the singularity of Yichida, which in turn is transformed into the living, or J flows into Neshama or Pneuma, until before Neshama, the levels of the soul were impersonal. Neshama, associated with the universe of Bariah or creation, begins to belong to a specific individual, and is, so to speak, its subtlest sheath or body, its contact between the personal and the transpersonal, between the divine and the human. From Bariah arises Yetzirah, formation, i.e., that which is created in Bariah begins to acquire form in Yetzirah. This formation would seem to correspond to the first activation of a distortion of space, and the corresponding letter of God's name is the Latin Vav, or V. The corresponding level of the soul is the soul level. The corresponding soul level is Ruach or spirit, and it could be thought of as the mechanism that in acting distorts space. Before Ruach, there are no distortions. Finally, after formation, there is the action in the universe of Asaya, which corresponds with the last letter of God's name, He, and with the level Nephesh or soul. The four letters of God's name Yud, He, Vav, He form the Tetragrammaton and are a true algorithmic system containing the scheme of creation from the living to its manifestation in action. Each level of consciousness is given by the identification of the observer with any of the 5 possible layers of the soul, from Nephesh or individual soul to Yichida, the primordial singularity. This Kabbalistic model is longitudinal because each level of it comes or is born from a precedent and gives rise to a consequent in a chain that begins in a singularity which acquires life, pneuma, spirit, and finally soul. The concentric model of the Kabbalah is known as the scheme of the Sephiroth, and 10 of them have been described, forming the tree of life. Each sephira is an attribute or quality of consciousness and constitutes an emanation from the Ein Sof. The longitudinal model is imbricated within the concentric model because each sephira manifests through a process of emanation, creation, formation, and action. This process can be experienced using Kabbalistic meditation techniques. For example, Rabbi Joseph Zah devised a color meditation in which sustained concentration on a specific color, associated with a chakra, activates the quality of consciousness of that sephira. Another technique is to concentrate attention on the Hebrew name of the sephira or its attributes until these begin to be experienced. Some Kabbalists have associated the different Sephiroth with the parts of the human body. The extremes of the Sephirot, Keter and Melchit, refer to 2 extreme levels of consciousness, Keter the highest and Malshu its manifestation. The pattern of the Sephirot is concentric because each sephira is contained within the next, like the layers of an onion. However, it is also longitudinal in the sense that there are linear connections between each layer. Moreover, each universe from Atzilut to Asaya can be divided into 10 layers, corresponding to the Sephirot of that Kabbalah considers the existence of a luminous center linked to the Ein Sof, whose light illuminates each sephira in each universe. It will depend on the inner cleanliness of the individual, how much obstruction exists between his consciousness and the light. The less internal dirt there is, the more luminosity will arrive, and vice versa. An individual with an intense internal problem will act as possessing veils of obstruction for the light. In this conception, each sephira is an emanation of the light of the Ein Sof. Most, if not all, of the practical techniques of Kabbalah are aimed at purifying the veils, so that the light will not encounter obstructions. In turn, each sephira acts and is a kind of vessel or container of an attribute of the light, coming from the Ein Sof. Each of these vessels, when filled by the light, activates an attribute or quality of the consciousness. A similarity between this conception and the syntergic theory is the existence of the syntergic bands being the light, and the veils, the necessary syntergia that a neural field must possess to establish a congruent and clean interaction with some syntergic band, and thus activate the conscious experience associated with the attributes of this one. According to the Kabbalah, and in accordance with the syntergic theory, the light never disappears, but the veils of obstruction can filter it so much that its luminosity may not be enough to fill some vessel. In the syntergic theory, it is considered that the syntergic bands always exist, waiting for some neural field to acquire enough syntergic power to interact congruently with them. The theosophical model. Theosophy has its contemporary origin in the writings of Madame Blavatsky, who founded this current of thought that was enriched by the studies of Annie Besant and Leadbeater, among others. According to theosophy, we possess different bodies, each of which is associated with a level of consciousness. These bodies are 7 in number. 1. The physical. 2. The etheric. 3. The astral. 4. The mental. 5. The spiritual. 6. The cosmic. And 7. The nirvanic. According to Rajneesh, not only is the consciousness different in each of the bodies, but also the quality and contents of the dreams. The consciousness will vary depending on the identification of the observer with one or another of the bodies. It is important to mention that the denomination body refers to an organization or structure belonging to a certain dimension of space. The existence of 7 bodies would imply the existence of 7 dimensions. An experimental procedure that exemplifies the existence of structures belonging to different dimensions is cymatics. In it, 2-dimensional patterns are created when a fine powder placed on a metal plate is set to vibrate by a sound of a certain frequency. When the frequency of the sound is increased sufficiently, the pattern becomes 3-dimensional. We have here 2-dimensional bodies resulting from the interaction at different frequencies between a vibrational field and a medium. One 2-dimensional body and the other 3-dimensional. The theosophical bodies would seem to be located in this same condition of being stable structures located in different dimensions. We will see later that the syntergic bands and their congruent interaction with neural fields can be conceived from a similar perspective. In the same way could be understood the Sephiroth, the Kabbalistic universes, and the levels of the soul. The first body is the physical, and its structure is organic. Its organ of thought and experience is the brain as we know it. It is limited by time and space, and is a hypercomplex and stable distortion of space. Its level of consciousness is 3-dimensional. The second body, etheric, is, according to theosophy, more subtle than the physical and remains invisible to it. It is capable of traveling through space, leaving, so to speak, the physical body, and its perception is more direct and subtle than that of the latter, since it does not require organic receptors to decode the structure of the lattice. The perceptual action of the etheric body could explain the extraocular vision in which trained children are able to perceive the visual world without the use of their retinal receptors. The etheric body is more linked to the neuronal field and the lattice, and has a structure that is more energetic than cellular. The dreams of the physical body are in causal correspondence with brain activity and can be stimulated by activating the organic receptor mechanisms. On the other hand, dreams of the etheric body correspond to etheric stimuli, also located in the structure of space. Thus, someone can dream that he flies and actually does so because the movements of the etheric body are not bound or restricted by spatial gravitation. According to Rajneesh, the so-called spiritual visions correspond to the etheric body and are etheric dreams. The etheric body includes space within its field of action. That is, it frees itself from spatial restriction, and space ceases to be an obstacle to its action. Thus, the spatial dimension in which the etheric body acts is incorporated into its interior, while that same dimension remains external to the physical body. The astral body incorporates not only space, but also time. Like the etheric body, the astral body can be located in any zone of space, but has no limit to travel to the past, even remote. The astral body, according to Rajneesh, is capable of remembering previous lives and corresponds to Jung's collective unconscious. From the syntergic point of view, The physical body is linked to the brain, the etheric body to the lattice, and the neuronal field, while the astral body identifies more with both hyperfields, but without being able to transcend them. The mental body incorporates, besides the temporal dimension towards the past, the future personal time. It is, so to speak, in a dimension in which time and space are unified. The functioning of the mental body implies an expansion in the duration of the present, in which the past and the future are included within a perceptual unity. This same expansion is related to sensory activation, in which visual perception, for example, functions in a greater duration of the present than auditory perception. The functioning of the astral body involves the same expansion but in a much greater order of magnitude. The mental body remains an individual body, while the spiritual body is transpersonal and therefore incorporates and transcends both hyperfields. The experiences of the spiritual body are shared by all those who live it. It is a body of the species and not of a particular individual. The cosmic body is the preamble to unity consciousness. This body transcends space, time, individuality, and the conscious-unconscious dichotomy. From the perspective of the cosmic body, everything possesses consciousness. The nirvanic body cannot be described because language no longer exists in it. It is equivalent to unity consciousness and a complete identity between the neural field and the basic structure of the lattice. The shamanic model. The shamanic model is bifactorial, that is, it considers the existence of two general levels of consciousness. Some shamans call these two realms, the visible world and the invisible world. Other shamans call them the tonal and the nawal. The visible world is equivalent to the tonal and refers to the level of everyday consciousness. On the other hand, the invisible world or nawal refers to a level of consciousness only accessible to the seers. The Oguruim shamans of the Sierra Tarahumara speak of the coexistence of three spirits in each person, denoting the presence of at least three levels of consciousness. The invisible world for the graniceros of the state of Morelos in Mexico is populated by astral beings that defy gravity and travel through space doing helpful work. The shaman can have access to that subtle realm by acquiring in his contact with the other level of consciousness. Some Mexican shamans are able to penetrate into mediumistic trance states, changing not only their usual personality, but manifesting a knowledge that does not belong to the level of everyday waking consciousness. The lineage of the shaman Nawal Don Juan Matus of Sonora has developed a whole model about consciousness and its levels. In this model, perception appears as a result of the alignment of two systems of emanations, one external to the body and the other internal. The body referred to in this model is not the organic body, but a luminous energetic body that is visible to a seer. The alignment of emanations is modulated through the action of a focalization mechanism that Don Juan Matus calls the lace point. This is located on the surface of the body or luminous cocoon and, depending on its position in the body, aligns different bands of emanations, giving rise to perceptions of alternative realities. The levels of consciousness depend on the depth at which the point of embedding is located. The similarity between this model and the syntergic model, which states that perception arises as a result of the congruent interaction between a neural field and the space-time lattice, is obvious. One of the common characteristics of all authentic shamans is their capacity for direct communication, which allows them to know, without the use of verbal instruments, the state of consciousness of those who visit them. This capacity indicates that the shaman's neural field is in the possibility of fluid interaction with other neural fields, and with the capacity to decode them. In the same way, the shaman seems to be able to decode and directly experience both hyperfields. One could postulate the existence of a level of shamanic consciousness that I have called the shamanic band. The shamanic model is complex and varies from lineage to lineage, although in all of them there are common characteristics such as those mentioned above, and especially the existence of a generalized shamanic consciousness mode. The Buddhist model. The Buddhist model is also bifactorial and is exemplified in the life of its creator. Approximately 2,500 years ago, the one we know as Buddha was born the son of a king. His childhood was spent isolated inside his father's palace and surrounded by all comforts. He never knew sickness, old age, and poverty. One day he decided to leave the imperial gardens, and for the first time he had contact with the people. Amazed and pained, he became aware of the existence of invalidity and grief. He abandoned his aristocratic life and for years underwent multiple teachings in order to achieve his own enlightenment. Desperate because neither asceticism, nor religious practices, nor control techniques helped him, he sat down under a tree to meditate with the resolution to die or become enlightened. After several days and seeing a star, he achieved what he desired. From that moment on, he dedicated himself to teaching, and for the rest of his days he did so. His mind was of pristine clarity, and through hundreds of discourses given to thousands of disciples, he managed to create a whole movement of spiritual regeneration which still inspires and guides millions of people. Buddha was a true teacher, and as such, he taught everyone according to their needs and levels of understanding. His more advanced students created their own schools and lineages, trying to preserve intact and without deviations the original teaching. But since Buddha imparted an individualized method to each disciple, these schools differ from each other, although they all retain the same direction. For example, there are at least 3 schools of Vipassana. All use observation as a developmental technique, but each in different areas and content. Observation of bodily sensations, observation of emotions and thoughts, observation of the environment. All 3 claim to be the repositories of the original teaching of Buddha and consider the others as distant from it when in fact they are all the original teaching. The bifactoriality of the Buddhist model is the same that Buddha lived. His 2 states of consciousness are the daily consciousness prior to enlightenment and enlightened consciousness. The level of daily consciousness is that in which there is an identification with emotional, bodily contents or mental fluctuations. The level of enlightened consciousness transcends fluctuating and temporary identifications and places the adept in a state of contact with the reality of the pure self. In that state, pleasure and pain are seen from the same perspective, and there are no mental attachments or sufferings. The enlightened human being is liberated and attains his true identity as the total reality itself. Buddha described a great number of states of consciousness, and his analysis of mental conditions and their vicissitudes have not been surpassed. Nowadays, there are many different schools of Buddhism which use a wide repertoire of meditation techniques, but all of them can be placed within 3 main currents: the Hinayana, the Mahayana, and the Vajrayana. Hinayana considers that enlightenment is individual and depends on personal work in isolation and solitude. The Mahayana also considers that enlightenment is individual, but it cannot be attained unless everyone attains it. The Mahayana Buddhist helps others to attain enlightenment even while postponing his own. His approach is more congruent with unity consciousness and with the development of universal love and compassion. Vajrayana uses the energy of emotions as a vehicle to achieve enlightenment. One of Buddha's main discourses, the Maha-Satipatthana, exemplifies the method of this enlightened one. In it, the Buddha enjoins his disciples to maintain a detached observation of their bodily sensations, their emotions, their mental contents, and their feelings, pointing out subtextually that any identification with them does not liberate, but instead their witnessing from the position of the observer leads to enlightenment. In the Sarangama Sutra, there is another indication in the same sense. Here, the existence of different strata or levels of consciousness is mentioned. Each level is lived as the ego of the preceding level, and becomes the content of the consequent level when the latter is reached. In this model, the fundamental consideration is the non-existence of an absolute ego state and the idea that what makes one advance from level to level of consciousness is the inclusion of contents of experience within a process of inclusive observation. These considerations clearly coincide with the description of the processes of neuroalgorithmization discussed in the preceding chapters. On the other hand, one of the most cherished concepts in Buddhism is that of sunyata, or emptiness. Sunyata is understood as the idea that neither objects nor the self possess absolute and independent existence. On the contrary, everything is part of an interdependent matrix of relationships. The model of transpersonal psychology. Transpersonal psychology incorporates teachings from the Hindu, Buddhist, Theosophical, and Christian, Islamic, and Jewish mysticism traditions into its body of doctrine. It is called transpersonal because it is interested in development beyond a personal ego, and its field of study includes the transcendent states of consciousness. According to transpersonal psychology, the most natural and highest level of consciousness is that of unity consciousness, in which the differences between object and subject, observer and observed, are diluted in a unique and all-encompassing reality. Consciousness exists in everything, but human beings fragment and limit it by assigning it boundaries of separation. These boundaries are given by limiting identifications. The most common of all identities is the one associated with the ideal of the self. When a child is educated, both his parents and his school pressure him to accept their set of cultural values considered positive and reject others labeled as negative. The appearance of negative behaviors is punished, and the manifestation of positive thoughts, ideas, and actions is rewarded. Little by little, the infant identifies with the positive aspects and represses the negative ones. If a society considers certain bodily needs to be negative, it teaches to block them even when they manifest themselves naturally. The first frontier of consciousness is thus established. When the negative aspects cross this frontier, the subject himself takes charge of denying them as part of his real identity, accepting only the positive as valid and true. Thus a personality or mask and a shadow are created. Mask and a shadow. The mask is what is accepted, and the shadow is what is rejected. When the shadow is activated, the subject accuses the outside or other subjects for its appearance. In the most severe cases, the shadow manifests itself as hallucinations or delusions of persecution. The subject, unable to accept the negative aspects as part of his real identity, projects them onto the others, thus safeguarding his identity with the positive aspects. When the tension between the personality and the shadow becomes insurmountable, an identity crisis ensues, which either somatizes, causing illness and, in its extreme, death, or triggers a process of incorporation of the shadow into the mask. When the latter happens, and the subject manages to accept as part of him/her the negative that he/she previously rejected and projected to the outside, a change of consciousness occurs. In this change, the subject acquires an ego which integrates the positive and negative aspects into a unity. This new identification incorporates the body and its needs as part of the real identity. A boundary of separation is diluted and consciousness expands. However, at this level of consciousness, which Ken Wilber calls the centaur, and which already includes the body and the shadow, there is still a boundary between the self and the other, or between the subject and the object. To access a new level of consciousness, the notion of body must undergo an expansion. In this expansion, events, experiences, and patterns that were previously considered as belonging to the external, i.e., the not-self, are incorporated into the self. In this way, the centaur begins to identify with its territory, and an approach to unity with others takes place. The others and oneself are no longer separated, but are lived as united in a new identity. Further on, the subject recognizes himself as a true Son of Man. That is, his consciousness is no longer that of an independent and separate person, but human in the highest sense of the word. All human emotions, all feelings and experiences that are capable of being lived as a human being, are accepted as part of the identity. It is no longer so-and-so who experiences, but it is the human being in so-and-so that manifests itself. This identification with the human is a more expanded level of consciousness than the centaur consciousness, but it is still limited and with boundaries of separation. The next level of consciousness could be called cosmic when the Son of Man incorporates the cosmos as part of his real identity. Finally, the cosmic man becomes the self or pure existence, and denominations and partial identities cease to exist. Unity consciousness is thus attained. All levels of consciousness are associated with layers of identification, and with fainter and fainter boundaries, until the last division is broken, and one lives experiencing that which has no name as the true. At this level it is understood that any image or perception sees itself, and that what it experiences is that, focused on oneself, and finally, that and oneself eventually merge into the one. The syntergic model. The greatest desire of every thinker is to reach a conception of reality that allows us to accept its infinite diversity, but at the same time places it in the perspective of a unifying vision of it. The syntergic model intends to achieve this ambitious purpose through the conceptualization of a scheme that explains the creation of perception. According to the syntergic model, consciousness is an attribute of the lattice of space-time, whose fundamental or basic state also constitutes the primordial state of consciousness, which could well be called pure consciousness. The different levels of consciousness are as many layers of the distortions that the basic structure of the lattice can assume. Human consciousness, for example, appears when the human brain manages to create a neuronal field that establishes a hypercomplex macrodistortion in the lattice. From this point of view, a visual image, as we have already seen, is in itself a particular three-dimensional distortion of the lattice that requires, in order to be activated, a human brain and a neural field, but does not need an observer to exist. That is why S.M. Goenka, one of the most famous Vipassana masters, once stated that the image sees itself, and the sound hears itself. The different qualities of consciousness and its levels are explained by the syntergic theory as being associated with discrete layers of lattice organization. These syntergic bands correspond also with discrete neurosyntergic strata of the neural field. The lattice would appear to be able to distort along a continuum, without abrupt steps. The same could be considered for the neurosyntergic of the neuronal field. That is to say, theoretically, there would have to be neither syntergic bands in the lattice, nor quantum levels of neurosyntergic organization of the neural field. However, all the evidence described in this chapter about the existence of different levels of the consciousness points out that a discrete organization must be assumed for both the lattice and the neural field. Thus, each level of consciousness would correspond to a congruent interaction between a syntergic band and a neural field, with a syntergic level analogous to the syntergic level of the corresponding lattice band. Just as each point of the lattice contains the totality, so each experience is an experience of the totality by the totality itself. Whether or not we understand it this way depends on our level of understanding and the identity we assume. To experience a visual image as seen by itself requires a realization that is difficult to achieve. It is easier to arrogate to ourselves a concrete identity and consider it as the center of perception, since that is more in accordance with common sense, which presents us with separate and independent centers of existence, such as objects or organic bodies. Each sensory quality is a level of consciousness and corresponds to a particular syntergic band in congruent interaction with a neuronal field of a specific neurosyntergic. The latter is determined in part by the informational density of the neural field, which in turn depends on the amount of neuronal interactions. This is given by the duration of the cerebral processing, and therefore associated with the neurosynergic is a functioning in a certain duration of the present. I had already mentioned that the expansion of the duration of the present determines a defined temporal perception in which a series of events occurring in different times are unified. Temporal unification is a transformation of space into time, and therefore can be conceived as a penetration into tetradimensionality. Thus, each level of consciousness could be conceived as functioning in tetradimensionality or as penetrating it. Tetradimensionality possesses consciousness as an attribute, so that each sensory quality, with a different duration of present, and each level of consciousness also occurring in a particular duration of present, could be conceived as different layers of penetration into the tetradimensional universe, until at the limit of maximum expansion of the duration of present, what exists is the pure tetradimensionality of the lattice in pure consciousness. In conclusion, the orbitals of consciousness are the different levels that consciousness is capable of assuming, from its identification with concrete aspects of reality to the consciousness of unity, where there are no dichotomies and separations between objects and subjects. At this level of fusion between the observer and the observed, the resulting experience is that the image sees itself, and the sound hears itself. The different levels of consciousness depend on the syntagee of the neural field at the level of experience and on the neuroalgorithmic capacity at the level of understanding. Chapter 5. The directionality factor. Both the neural field and both hyperfields possess ubiquity. That is, they incorporate their structure to that of the lattice in all their locations. I had already mentioned that one of the characteristics of the lattice distortions is that of affecting and being contained in all points of the lattice. A neural field, as a hypercomplex macrodistortion of the lattice, also fulfills this basic condition. Until we know the limits of informational density and inclusion that the points of the lattice are capable of containing, we cannot know whether a neural field can be represented in total form, in the same dimension of space as other less complex distortions of the lattice. But whether the answer to this question is affirmative or not, the condition of ubiquity must be fulfilled also for the neural field. From this point of view, experience need not be localized. That is to say, since the interaction between the neural field and the lattice takes place throughout the length and breadth of space, the experience would not have to appear localized in any particular zone of the universe. The fact is, however, that it is. In general, we can conceive of the existence of three main localizations of experience: one within the neural field, two at the edge of the interaction between the neural field and the lattice, and three in the lattice itself. The first location leads to an intracorporeal experience. The second, in a localization of the experience in the experience itself, and the third, in an extracorporeal localization. The studies of Mexican shamanism demonstrate the existence of human beings who can localize their perception in different zones of the lattice, far from their organic body. Doña Pachita, for example, was able to locate herself outside her body in different places of the space. But it is not necessary to consider these portentous feats of perception to realize that we perceive the interaction between our neural field and the lattice in a focused way. When, for example, we observe a landscape or any object, each point of the lattice contains it in addition to all the information of the universe. As Moses Cordovero said, "Where you are, there are all the worlds." We could, when we see the landscape, decode the image of the craters of the moon or perceive a distant galaxy because each point of the lattice contains the information of them. The fact that the resulting image is that of the landscape or the object, and not another, means that we possess a mechanism of focused attention. Synergic theory calls this mechanism directionality factor. This same mechanism of focalization must be the one that acts intracorporeally, bringing to the field of consciousness different levels of brain activity. The most usual of these levels is at the end of the cortical processing and is the one that allows us to experience as we do. Neither the output of the retina is perceptually conscious, nor is the thalamic activation, nor is the activation of the different cerebral or cerebellar levels. We are conscious of the final resultant of our brain processes, that is, of the interaction of the neural field with the lattice. However, with proper training, we can become aware of cortical and even subcortical neural activity. It will depend on where we focus the directionality factor, to which level of intracortical activity we will have access. Therefore, the directionality factor determines in its focus the conscious perception of both external aspects of our organic body and internal aspects of the latter. In fact, in both intracorporeal and extracorporeal activity, all its levels and layers involve an interaction between the lattice and the neural field. The complexity of this interaction is lower at the retinal level compared to the cortical, but it is realized in both. In the same way, the neural field interacts simultaneously with all the degrees of syntagee of the lattice, but only one of the interference patterns resulting from this interaction is perceived with consciousness. From all of the above, it follows that the focusing in consciousness of a zone of the lattice or of any of its distortion levels requires a focusing mechanism. As we saw in the previous chapter, in the Mexican shamanic tradition and within the lineage of Don Juan Matus de Sonora, this mechanism is called the point of lace. There are at least two possibilities to explain the functioning of the directionality factor. In the first option, the conscious focus is a natural resultant of the neurosyntergic level of the neural field, and it is not necessary to resort to some focalization mechanism external to the field interaction itself. In this alternative, what is focused depends on the achievement of a congruence between the lattice and the neural field in one or more of its syntergic levels. The second possibility does require consideration of the existence of an external focusing mechanism and invalidates the interaction between the lattice and the neural field as sufficient to explain the conscious focusing of perception. To accept this second alternative, it is necessary that there must exist a reality independent of the lattice, but capable of interacting with and modifying this basic structure of space. The Kabbalistic model supports this option, as we saw in the previous chapter. The distortion of the lattice, according to Kabbalah, occurs from the universe of Yetzirah or formation and manifests in Asaya or action. Prior to Yetzirah, that is, before the lattice, Kabbalah contemplates the existence of at least 4 universes corresponding to 3 levels of the soul. According to this model, the directionality factor is commanded from outside the lattice. Since most human beings identify with the lattice and its distortions, the origin of this command goes unnoticed. Only whoever achieves a perception of the universes prior to the lattice, that is to say, whoever has managed to situate himself on a level of the soul, superior to ru'edge or spirit, will recognize that the focus of his attention is always a transcendent matter. From this perspective, human beings are instruments of a more expanded reality. This reality manifests through us in forms that are individualized and dependent on one's bodily and mental structure. It would seem that our development implies achieving an openness for that which constitutes reality to flow freely through us. The basic postulation of the syntergic theory in considering perception as a result of the congruent interaction of the neural field and the lattice and the existence of the syntergic bands explain this human condition of being an instrument of reception of a more expanded reality. Chapter 6. The Observer and Individuality. The path proposed by the syntergic theory for the attainment of unity consciousness implies the simultaneous incorporation in an act of observation of so many contents of experience, until these and the observer merge into one. In more technical terms, the above process could be called expanded neuroalgorithmization. Just as the highly inclusive polysensory neuroalgorithms incorporate all the information of the brain within a high-powered pattern, giving rise to an experience of egoic integration, so the expansion of neuroalgorithmization to the degree of including all possible information makes, at its extreme, the included information and the resulting neuroalgorithm indistinguishable from the lattice itself, giving rise to the disappearance of the difference between object. In this unity consciousness, the observer and its contents of perception merge into a unity, that is to say, they become one. In Pantanal's aphorisms on yoga, this author describes the technique of samyama as suitable to achieve the above. Samyama consists in observing an object and maintaining its observation until the observer and the object merge into one. This merging yoga calls samadhi. The path of yoga involves the samadhic observation of more and more subtle objects, until the last object is the self itself. At that point, unity between object and subject is achieved. In the Kabbalah model, each level of the soul, from nephesh to yichida, singularity, is more subtle, and likewise the universe associated with each soul represents, as in yoga, an object of observation of ever greater subtlety. Thus, for example, a saya or action would correspond to visible distortions of the lattice. On the other hand, the Ein Sof would be associated with a more intangible reality. Kabbalistic development, like yogic development, seems to involve this ascent from the gross to the subtle. We have then apparently two paths of development. In the shamanic path and in the syntergic technology, the ascent to unity consciousness occurs when all possible experiences are unified in a simultaneous observation. In the yogic and Kabbalistic path, towards the same unity consciousness, the observation is in steps from the most concrete to the most abstract. Of course, samadhi in the self implies merging with all previous levels, just as in Kabbalah. Identity with the singularity includes the incorporation of all previous levels of the souls. In the same way, in the syntergic model, neuroalgorithmization incorporates both conditions, the simultaneous inclusion of different elements and the increase of abstraction. In fact, a neuroalgorithm of high power is correlative with a more subtle level of reality, while a neuroalgorithm of poor inclusion corresponds with more concrete levels of the same reality. Therefore, the two paths of development are and lead to the same thing. The synthesis of a neuroalgorithm of high power is associated with the activation of a neuronal field of high neurosyntergic, and therefore with the possibility of congruent interaction of this neuronal field with a syntergic band of high coherence, informational density and frequency. This mechanism of interaction implies a true perceptual capacity on the part of the brain and explains our capacity to receive subtle information. Each human being is characterized by an individualized capacity given by the structure of his brain, and therefore by the specific and personal morphology of his neural field. This individual morphology is glimpsed in the also individual morphology of the interhemispheric correlation pattern that each brain manifests. Therefore, individuality could be defined as dependent on the particular and specific capacity of reception, interaction, or capture of more or less subtle aspects of the information contained in the different syntergic bands. Even in unity consciousness, individuality keeps expanding and not disappearing. But obviously, individuality is not a state or condition of passivity. Each human being represents a unique and non-repeatable event in the whole history of the universe. It could well be affirmed that in addition to being receivers of syntergic bands, we are the creators of the same. The most evolved human beings of all times have bequeathed to the species the syntergic bands that they created. Some traditions, such as the Tibetan, have techniques to recreate such bands and thus experience the states of consciousness of their creators. To achieve this portentous feat of perception, they use visualizations. The famous tankas in which Buddhist deities are drawn in great detail are visualized with the utmost accuracy by trained adepts. The geometric schemes, colors, and forms inscribed in these drawings, when visualized, activate a cerebral state that serves to activate a neural field with the exact morphology to establish a congruent interaction with the syntergic band that represents the level of consciousness of the corresponding deity. Kabbalah has also developed visualization techniques to, for example, recreate the state of consciousness associated with the different Sephiroth. To do so, the meditator visualizes the Hebrew name of the Sephira in question, thus creating a neural field that interacts congruently with the syntergic band associated with the Sephira to be experienced. In the consciousness during the daily vigil, reality is filtered by the mind in such a way that what is perceived is colored by the conception, emotions, feelings, and the state of vitality of the subject. Since in the daily vigil what exists is an identification with the mind and the body, they will determine the perception. If vitality exists, everything will be seen in that light. If sadness, reality will appear sad. If optimism, optimistic, etc., etc. When the subject remembers that he can witness the state of his mind and his bodily conditions from the reference of a detached observation, a perceptual leap occurs in which reality ceases to be nuanced or filtered, and the existence of a self that transcends the variable conditions of his mind and the states of his body is perceived. In this way, the condition of the observer is activated, and in it there are no variations but a stable and constant point of reference. Moreover, the observer appears as neutral with respect to the changes of his perception. Since these are unified in the act of observation, a high-powered neuroalgorithmic state of functioning is activated because, regardless of the alterations of the information that feeds it, the observer does not fluctuate. In this condition, the level of consciousness of the daily vigil is transformed into the level of self-consciousness in which the observer acts as an identity. However, at the next level of consciousness, the observer disappears as a separate entity from its objects of observation, and the unity consciousness is reached in which the difference between subject and object ends. Both at the level of the daily consciousness, as well as in the consciousness of the self, and in the consciousness of unity, individuality exists, but it expands from level to level, and what is transformed is the understanding of the self, mediated through an adequate neuroalgorithmization. The passage from self-consciousness to unity consciousness occurs when the act of observation incorporates all the possible contents of the experience. The observer unifies all these contents, and therefore the unity of the observer and his objects of observation is produced. This unity consciousness is a contact with pure existence, and both existence and life itself surpass all attempts at theoretical explanation. Chapter 7. Practical Repercussions. From the postulates of the syntergic theory, I have developed a meditation technique and a psychophysiology of power. Self-elusive meditation is a technology of consciousness designed to activate the level of self-consciousness and unity consciousness. It is based on the detached and simultaneous observation of different areas of experience, bodily sensations, thoughts, emotions, and the environment. The psychophysiology of power is a technology of consciousness designed to positively influence both hyperfields. It is based on the consideration of the existence of a collective directionality factor capable of being modified by the individual directionality factor, and on a strange attractor of the ideal future of the hyperfield with which it is possible to establish a contact. The hyperfield can be conceived as a macro-neural field which, like the individual neural field, possesses a direction of development and a focus through the focalization of a collective directionality factor. The possibility of affecting the hyperfield and modifying the focus of its directionality factor is based on the experimental discovery of the influences that the brain activity of one subject exerts on other subjects. In these experiments, we discovered that if two subjects interact preverbally, the one with higher levels of interhemispheric correlation modifies the interhemispheric correlation of his partner by attracting him to his own level. Since the interhemispheric correlation is an index of the degree of neurosynergic of the brain, the results indicate that there is a direct relationship between neurosynergic and personal power. In this way, it can be deduced that the higher the neurosynergic of a brain, the more it will affect the neurosynergic of other brains, of its neural fields, and therefore of the hyperfield itself. On the other hand, just as there is a direction of individual development towards unity consciousness, represented by an axis of neurosynergic increase of the individual neural field, so there is an evolutionary direction of the hyperfield. The synergic theory postulates that this direction of hyperfield evolution is not random and is commanded by a strange attractor. The strange attractor of the ideal future of the hyperfield is equivalent to the omega point of Teilhard-de and can be conceived as the state of greater centrality and complexity of the universe that attracts to itself the distortions of the lattice. This attraction is responsible for the elementary distortions of the lattice to organize themselves into complex systems from the atom, the molecule, the living cell, and the human organism, leading to the organization of the most complex lattice, the human brain. In the psychophysiology of power, the contact and perception of the strange attractor of the ideal future of the hyperfield is produced when the individual neurosynergic is increased through self-elusive meditation and when the duration of the present is expanded. This contact between the individual and the strange attractor of the ideal future of the hyperfield is experienced as ecstasy and is what the Christian mystical tradition calls state of grace. The psychophysiology of power is a psychophysiology of the leadership of consciousness, and as such represents one of the practical applications of greatest repercussion derived from the synergic theory. Another of the possible practical repercussions derived from the synergic theory is the possibility of modifying the curvature of space, affecting the gravitational force. In an experiment performed in my laboratory, we discovered that changes in interhemispheric correlation determined gravitational oscillations in the vicinity of the subject. The above means that modifications of the neurosynergic of a neural field affect the lattice synergy. The possibility of affecting gravitation at will and using this gravitational modification has immense practical implications, such as transportation, levitation, and even the creation of a gravitational engine. Since the lattice is a superconductor, the increase in coherence of a brain is equivalent to and produces an action similar to the Meissner effect, in which a magnet levitates when placed on a superconducting material. Another practical application of the synergic theory is in the field of communication. In a recent experiment, we discovered the existence of the transferred potential. When two subjects have managed to establish a preverbal empathic communication and are then separated from each other, the stimulation of one of the two subjects activates a potential in the other without the mediation of sensory signals. The transferred potential is a manifestation of a direct exchange of specific information from brain to brain and could be used as a means to send information without the use of electronic instruments. We are about to initiate an experiment to test if there is a rate of transmission of the transferred potential. The prediction is that the direct brain-to-brain information exchange is instantaneous, so that the communication technology that could be derived would allow an informational exchange without time delays and at any distance of separation. On the other hand, the capacity of the lattice to contain colossal information in each of its points could be used in the invention of computer systems that use the same structure of the lattice, both to store information and to carry out computational and informational analysis operations. The invention of a lattice computer, similar to the human brain, that would be able to create energy fields similar to the neural field and take advantage of its operations, is another of the practical repercussions of the synergic theory. Finally, the lattice has a practically infinite energetic capacity in each of its points. One could conceive of the creation of an instrument that would extract energy directly from the lattice and transform it into electricity, heat, etc. This lattice energy generator would solve all the energy supply problems of the planet. In the same way, the plastic capacity of the lattice and the possibility of distorting it into specific shapes could be used to materialize objects and even biological organs that could be used both for the satisfaction of material needs and in medical practice. This application, together with the direct decoding of lattice to restore vision in blind people, has already been tested in practice. Epilogue. Unity. The secret lies in the processes of unification. For the cellular consciousness, the bodily unity is a secret. Each cell receives influences coming from an inaccessible and totally transcendent totality with respect to itself. At the same time, however, the totality is algorithmically represented in each of the elements that form it, and the cell does not escape this holographic law. The same thing happens with the human consciousness. This, in each one of us, receives influences from an inaccessible and totally transcendent totality, and yet, at the same time, this totality is algorithmically represented in each individual consciousness. In the brain, the same dynamics is structured in the two processes that the synergic theory considers fundamental to understand experience and perception: neuroalgorithmization and the activation of the neural field. Through convergence circuits, information from the whole brain is concentrated in polysensory and high-convergence cell populations. The resulting neuroalgorithms represent, in a dynamic way, the information of the unit and of the totality in each of its elements. On the other hand, the neural field is the medium that allows access to an even more powerful unification, that of the hyperfield. Both processes complement each other and are necessary. A percept cannot be created without a neural field capable of distorting the lattice of space-time. The same percept cannot be identified if it has not been neuroalgorithmized. In the same way that each element receives influences coming from the unity of which it is part, each element of a totality affects the unity. For example, a neuroalgorithmic modification produces a concomitant alteration of the neural field and the hyperfield. The influence of one element is diluted as the unity enlarges. Thus, the same neuroalgorithmic change that powerfully alters a neural field affects, but to a lesser extent, the hyperfield. Exactly the same dynamics have been described in the field of mysticism. For example, Moshe Chaim Luzzatto wrote that there are spiritual forces coming from the oneness that affect every human consciousness, and that in turn the individual consciousness sends influences that affect the spiritual realms. The synergic model explains such influences through its central postulation, namely the interaction between the neural field and the space-time lattice. We are part of a planetary organism of which we are cells. We are interconnected through the lattice and our neural fields. The synergic theory is a model that attempts to explain this planetary unity. Appendix. Reflections on time. A number of questions can be raised about time, from its objective existence to its relativity. I will start with the first question, namely, Whether its existence is real or whether it is only a subjective product of our psychological functioning, there is no doubt that time in its perception changes according to the psychological state. Everyone is familiar with the experience of feeling how a minute, measured by a clock, is subjectively lengthened when we are in a situation of great demand or danger, and how it is considerably shortened when we live a pleasurable experience. On the other hand, Albert Einstein was responsible for demonstrating that time has a relative reality which depends on the speed of the subject that measures it. As a traveler approaches the speed of light, his time slows down in relation to a motionless observer and ends up disappearing at the very limit of the speed of light. The famous paradox of the twins illustrates this temporal relativism. In it, one of the twins travels to a distant star at high speed, close to the speed of light, while the other remains on Earth. Upon the traveler's return, his brother has aged considerably more than he has. Thus, from both an objective and subjective point of view, time does not have an absolute existence in terms of the speed of its passing. Does this mean that time does not exist? To answer this question in the affirmative would imply denying the existence of the past and of a temporal direction of events. For example, if a drop of ink is poured into a glass of water, sooner or later all the water will be stained with the color of the ink. The direction of the process is from the drop to its dilution. It would be unthinkable and absurd to consider the existence of a reverse temporal direction. That is, from the dilution to the drop, and therefore one must assume the existence of a real and non-objective temporal directionality. However, some frontier physicists, such as Jacques Sarfati, are of the opinion that there is the possibility of the existence of elementary particles, tachyons, capable of traveling at superluminal velocities, and therefore in a temporal direction reversed with respect to the usual one, i.e., from the future to the past. As far as I know, it has not yet been possible to demonstrate the existence of tachyons, but it has been possible to demonstrate the existence of instantaneous interactions at a distance. That is to say, without delay. This implies that from an objective point of view, time is capable of disappearing. On the other hand, mystics and contemplatives of all ages have spoken of the existence of a state of consciousness that functions in timelessness. They affirm that everything that exists happens in an absolute present, in which neither the past nor the future exists. This means that also from a subjective point of view, time can cease to exist. How to combine all these different conceptions and arrive at a conceptualization that includes them without contradictions? One possibility in this sense is offered by the lattice model and the syntergic theory. According to our knowledge of the lattice, it is capable of varying six organization, from a basic level of total symmetry and coherence to its hyperdistortion given by its interactions with the neural field and with the hyperfield. It could be postulated that in the basic state of the lattice, time does not exist, and that a man whose neural field is of sufficient syntagee not to distort the lattice will experience the mystical experience of timelessness in an absolute present. On the other hand, in the distorted lattice, time does pass, and consequently also in the experience of a human being whose neural field distorts it. The subjective temporal relativity depends then on the level of distortion of the lattice, which in turn depends on the level of consciousness and the cerebral and perceptual functioning of a subject. The lattice in its basic state is as timeless as timelessness at the speed of light. This correspondence would seem to point out that in reality what we call speed of light corresponds to the basic referential state of immobility of the lattice itself. The constancy of the speed of light regardless of the speed of the measurer points in the same direction. In other words, it would seem that in the universe the reference of immobility is that of light, which we erroneously consider to be in motion, when in reality it is the manifestation of the basic state of the lattice. With respect to this immobile reference, everything has an elapsing, and we call it time. In relation to our perceptual functioning, the differences in this temporal passing produce notable effects, such as the different qualities of experience, which, as we have already seen, are related to the duration of the present and to the syntagee of the neural field. Our temporal capacity to distort the lattice is generally ephemeral. Every 50,000ths of a second, we create a visual image that does not remain static, but disappears to give way to the next image that merges with the first one through what Don Juan Matas called the glue of reality, thus giving us the illusion of continuity. The same happens with sounds, which merge with each other in a continuous process of creation and death. The question could be asked, what would happen if we could expand the duration of a visual perception? One would think that in that case we would be able to materialize the objects created by our cerebral functioning. In other words, we would fix the distortions of the lattice given by the interaction with our neural field. That this possibility can be realized, I have no doubt. In fact, some of the Mexican shamans such as Pachita were able to materialize objects and even biological organs. In general, the creation of different levels of reality depends on the time of its handling, and therefore a deep analysis of time is so fundamental and important. About the permanence of objects, an analysis can also be attempted. Why, for example, does a rock last longer than a cloud? A physicist would tell us that his science has already been able to understand and explain such differences, and that they are related to atomic and molecular structure. A solid is a solid because the interatomic distance within it is less than that in a liquid. A gas is an organization of atoms and molecules in which the empty spaces are much larger than those of a liquid, etc. However, why, if gas, liquid and solid are all different distortions of the same lattice, does the difference in distance result in varying levels of permanence? Does the permanence of a visual fantasy then depend on the distance between the distorted elements of the lattice? If we could imagine a solid, heavy rock, what is it that prevents it from materializing, and what is it that allows it to materialize? As I mentioned before, we have proven evidence about the possibility of materializing objects. So the questions I just posed are not a simple game of artifice, but a concern arising from empirical observation. Something in the morphology of the neural field and in its interaction with the lattice must be the key to understand both the different qualities of perceptual experience, light, sound, etc., and the permanence of lattice distortions in materialization phenomena. That something is related to time and its mystery. I said before that for an object moving at the speed of light, time does not pass, and that the same thing happens for the lattice at its basic level of total coherence and symmetry. On the other hand, for anything moving at a speed less than the speed of light, or for any distortion of the lattice, time does exist. This means that time could be the result of any change or modification of the basic structure of the lattice. The latter explains why temporal modifications associated with the presence of gravitational fields occur, since the latter are also alterations of the lattice structure, curvatures of space, as Einstein called them. Since the neural field modifies the lattice structure, the brain structure and its functioning are creators of time. On the other hand, the timeless structure of the lattice in its basic state, when modified by the human consciousness, is imbued with time. Consciousness is imbued with time. This probably means that time is, more than anything else, a human creation. However, a distortion of the lattice produced by any elementary particle or by a macroscopic body must also affect time if time, as I stated before, depends on the existence of distortions of the lattice. On the other hand, in speaking of time, we are assuming its non-existence in the same way that, in referring to being or consciousness subtextually, we are pointing to its non-existence. It is not possible to speak of something without assuming the existence of the opposite. Therefore, time implies non-time. The lattice model satisfies the necessity of the existence of timelessness in the undistorted lattice, and of time in the distorted lattice. Both brain activity and its products and inanimate matter and its variants distort the lattice. Therefore, both create time. About the author. Jacobo Grinberg Zilberbaum, born in 1946, disappeared on December 8, 1994, is or was a prolific Mexican researcher in the study of the brain and its relationship with consciousness, a profound connoisseur of meditation and an enthusiastic student of Kabbalah. His outstanding work promotes a redesign of the paradigms that govern the relationship between mind and matter, between science and consciousness. With his limited possibilities, he immersed himself in the brains of shamans and yogis, contrasting their experiences, trained children from 8 to 10 years old in remote vision, and scientifically confirmed telepathy and its different variables. He graduated from the Faculty of Sciences of the UNAM in Mexico, where he studied psychology, and among other postgraduate studies, he obtained a doctorate at the New York Medical College, during which he devoted himself mainly to keep an electrophysiological record of the human brain, exposed to geometric stimuli. One of the most popular stages of his professional career was the work carried out together with the legendary Mexican healer Pachita, with whom he worked from a scientific perspective on the methodological evaluation of the manifestations of consciousness in human beings. From these experiences he wrote the most popular of his books, Pachita, The Manifestations of Being. From his work with Pachita, which culminated in 1988, Grinberg would unfold his experience with the Mexican healer to construct one of his most representative theories, the syntergic theory. Subsequently, he deepened in the study of the energetic frequencies that the human being manifests during meditative states, which are measurable and therefore verifiable. In December 1994, Jacobo Grinberg mysteriously disappeared, a strange disappearance about which nothing is known yet. As a legacy, he left, in addition to his exemplary attitude towards the scientific study of the consciousness and multiple ethereal phenomena, the foundation of the National Institute for the Study of Consciousness, and more than 50 books, as well as countless studies and research. If you like this audiobook, share it with the people you appreciate. Thank you for following the channel, Bending Realities. A big hug and God bless you.